I'm the Economic Development Planner for the town of Eastham, and I want to welcome you to our second in a series of 3 public workshops on the North Eastham Village Center Master Plan. So this evening, we're going to be seeing some more detailed concepts for each of the 3 properties that are part of the master plan. And we'll have an opportunity, as we did last time, for all of you to give your thoughts. We have 2 mics this evening and 2 volunteers to help run them around. So we'll have one stationed on each side of the room. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Jeremy Lake of Union Studio, who is our consultant leading on this project. So thank you again for being here, and I'll hand it over to Jeremy.
Thank you, Lauren. Good evening, everyone. Again, my name's Jeremy Lake. Quick show of hands, who was here about a month ago when we did the first presentation? Which I imagine a fair number of you. All right, quick show of hands if you were not here a month ago at the first presentation. Good, because I was going to recap some stuff. I wanted to make sure we weren't wasting anybody's time. Quick show of hands, how many of you have no idea what this project is about at all? How far back do we need to go? Okay, everybody knows something, so that's a good starting point. I think you all are aware the whole point of this thing is we were hired to help the town, working with you all, to come up with a vision for these couple of parcels to sort of create a more of a village center, or at least a partial village center for the town of Eastham, right? There's opportunities here for a community center, for housing, for additional retail, to support the existing retail. So we were tasked with trying to understand how to forward what the Tea Time Committee has been doing with you all for 2 or 3 years now. We were basically handed the baton and said, now take it forward, you guys are the designers, help us start to really visualize how this comes together, how this all looks, and so that's what we're doing here with you all tonight. Quick agenda, this is what we plan to get through tonight. I'm going to reintroduce myself and Jeff Davis, who is here, who was not at the last presentation, so even if you were, you wouldn't have met Jeff. We're going to quickly recap the things that we talked about a month ago at the first public presentation. Again, about half of you weren't here, so I think that's a useful thing to try to go through. We won't belabor that because we do have a lot of new information to share tonight as well. Coming out of the first presentation, we had an online survey that we asked folks to take part in. Jeff is going to split the presenting duties with me tonight because he's the one that helped facilitate that online survey, so he's going to summarize some of the results, the major takeaways, some of the clear things we saw, a lot of things we saw where there's still a lot of uncertainty with folks, hearing multiple ideas on things. We will then get to the concepts. We're going to go one site at a time like we did last time, so even with the survey results, Jeff will sort of introduce the who we heard from, and then we'll kind of share the survey results site by site as we also go through the scheme. So he and I are going to be kind of tag teaming back and forth for a while. And then at the very end, again, we'll share with you sort of our next steps, what else is still coming. Along the way, we're going to ask you guys to weigh in on certain things. We'll do shows of hands. We'll ask you to weigh in on what do you like about what you're seeing, what you don't like what about you're seeing. Last time that seemed to work pretty well. We see this as sort of a big group discussion, right? So I am presenting, but we're here to listen at the same time too. Again, I'm Jeremy Lake with Union Studio. This is Jeff Davis with Horsley Witten Group. If you were here last time, Jonathan Ford from Horsley Witten Group was here, but Jeff is joining us tonight instead. I think there's a chance Rob Brennan from Cape Built, he was here last time as well. I'm pretty sure he was going to try to get here as well. He had another meeting, but was going to try to make it happen. He is with Cape Built. Cape Built is a development and construction firm based on the Cape. They have a lot of work around the Cape. He's part of our team to help weigh in on sort of what are the current conditions we're seeing in things like construction costs, et cetera. Working in tandem with us as well will be Eric Bush from Peregrine Group. They are a real estate advisory group as well. So he's going to really help us get a little bit into the weeds on feasibility issues, costs, finance, how you finance these kinds of projects, what the impacts of some of these things will be. So again, there's only 2 of us here tonight, but we actually do represent a much larger team that's going to be doing a lot of work over the summer too, right? So recap of the first presentation. Again, I think all of you are aware of the 3 sites that are in question here. It started with the Tea Time parcel. Town purchased that a few years ago. That's really what got the ball rolling. But recently they also acquired the Town Center Plaza site, which is the couple of businesses that are just north of the Cumberland Farms. And in combination, the idea was that those 2 could begin to create a sort of village center, if you will, for the North Eastham part of town. The reason the Council of Aging site is on the map is because there's also been a proposal to have them potentially move into a new community center on the Tea Time parcel. If they were to move out of the building they're in now, what do we do with it, right? So we were asked to think about, if that transition does in fact happen, what are some ideas for what to do there? So that's why it's 3 separate parcels, hopefully all sort of working together, and it's trying to solve that equation simultaneously, if you will. So again, I'm not going to go through literally every slide that we presented in the first presentation, or we'd be here twice as long, but we started by recapping the project history. Again, this is already at least 3 years in the making. We are relatively new to it, but you as a community are not. You've been talking to about this for quite a while. And the Tea Time Committee hosted a ton of great public outreach, got a lot of feedback. They're the ones that recommended the uses that we've been using as our launching point for our efforts. We shared what the project goals were. To summarize that, it's really, the Tea Time Committee and we were tasked with trying to look at this from all angles, right? This is not just a economic issue. This is not just a social issue. This is not just about sort of, infrastructure. It's all of those things. And so we have to consider all those things at the same time. And similarly, in terms of guiding principles, it was suggested that the design should incorporate traditional neighborhood design, so creating sort of a village pattern, if you will, while still making sure it has the look and feel of Eastham. Let's not introduce something that feels like it's out of place, out of scale, out of character. The design should include adequate infrastructure. We got to think about things like, how is the wastewater treated? That's a big picture issue that we're still trying to resolve, and actually we're not going to have resolved anytime soon, but those are the sorts of things we're still talking about, thinking about. Prioritize environmental stewardship. Balance the built environment with the natural environment, and improve the quality of life for all of Eastham's residents. So those were sort of the more global guiding principles we've been considering. In terms of our project schedule, we began back in February. In February and March, we did what we call our sort of pre-design phase. Before we start breaking out our pens, we got to listen first for a little while and do our due diligence. So that's when we read all of the reports. We read the Tea Time Committee suggestions, the housing production plan, the town's comprehensive plan, all those sort of background items that feed us in and make us aware of sort of the history of this and what the town's goals are for this. We also hosted a series of stakeholder sessions that I'll recap quickly as well in mid-April. So again, before we even started coming out to the broader public, we started with a few particular groups that had a real vested interest in these sites in one way or another. We then transitioned into this task 2, initial drafts. We were here, like I said, a month ago, May 11th, with the first public presentation. We're going to, again, show you some of the things we talked about then as well. It was just to start getting the ideas flowing a little bit. Tonight, we're going to be taking those ideas and getting much more granular with them, so you'll have something a little more real to react to. So we're here at the second public presentation, Wednesday, June 8th. Moving forward from here, we're going to let you guys have the summer off while we keep working on it. So that's when we're going to really dig in, start pulling out our calculators, getting really fine-toothed on a lot of these things, a lot of coordination with the town, to just sort of see how we can make the schemes that we're coming up with as feasible as possible, right? We don't want to come up with a pie-in-the-sky idea that we can't find private development partners to come in and help realize. So that's a lot of the work we'll be doing over the summer. And then we'll be back in the fall, and we'll be presenting to you all again at some point, date still to be determined, October, November, where we want to relay to you what we've been figuring out, what we've been talking about all summer, what we've been discovering, as sort of our final piece of helping craft the vision portion of this. So I mentioned those stakeholder sessions in mid-April. There were 5 sessions. Those are the 5 bullets at the top. First, we met with the Tea Time Committee, the Rec Department, and the Council on Aging. We brought them all together because, again, the Tea Time Committee has the sort of broad view of the sort of process that's been happening to date. And the Community Center, which is really one of the big focal elements of the Tea Time parcel, is meant to be shared between the Rec Department and the Council on Aging. So we wanted everybody to kind of be hearing what each other's interests and needs were all at the same time. The Town Center Plaza site has 6 existing businesses on it, and the town has, promised to work with them to make sure that they still have viable businesses as this thing moves forward. So we made sure to sit down with them and talk to them and listen to what they were worried about, what opportunities they saw, what things they were hoping for to come out of this process. That said, we also met more globally with the larger Eastham business community. Obviously, anything we do here impacts everything around it. So we wanted to make sure we had that perspective and understood the sorts of things that the businesses outside of these sites were thinking about or worried about. And similarly, the neighborhoods that are immediately adjacent to these properties, obviously they're concerned, right? What's going to happen here? How is this going to affect me? How's this going to change my quality of life? So we wanted to hear the things that they were concerned with. Again, we're trying to balance all of these various issues.
I'm sorry, when was that residential neighbors input taking place? 'Cause I'm one of the properties that joined one of these sites, and I just learned about this a month ago.
So those were in mid-April. I don't know, Lauren, if you want to address sort of the outreach of who we reached out to for those.
Test, test. Yes, so those were preliminary input sessions, and certainly by no means are the only opportunity to give input. We had a bit of a difficult time, I will be completely honest, doing outreach to the abutters because the town does not keep email addresses, and we weren't going to mail information about a Zoom meeting out, so we did that by affinity recruitment, so basically asking around, trying to figure out who we could find that could attend it. And so this series of workshops is another opportunity on top of that. That was just a preliminary input session, so please don't feel as if you won't have an opportunity to give your input. That's certainly not the case.
I agree with them. I live next door to it, and I was never asked anything.
Well, this is your opportunity. Yeah, you can definitely give input, and if you'd like to have a conversation offline, I'm more than happy to do that.
Again, we're not at the end, right? We're still very much in the midst of this thing. Even when we're done in the fall, it's not like that's the end either, right? This will be a multi-year process you guys are going through. It's not going to be quick. It's not going to be easy, but hopefully it's going to be very much worthwhile when it's all said and done. So the last group we met with were various town board and committee chairs. So it was also a chance for us to meet with folks that were representatives of various committees in the town. And so again, we were hearing all the various inputs and concerns those groups are having. So again, that was just initial round of conversations with folks. And that's why we're having these multiple public presentations as well, to try to get as many people's voices as we can through this process. And I'm not going to go through all the little takeaways on the bottom other than to say, really the takeaway, everything we heard basically reinforced the sorts of things we were hearing from the Tea Time Committee recommendations, from those guiding principles, from your comprehensive plan. All those things have been reinforcing each other. This was really a chance for, if there was some issue way off on left field that no one had raised prior that we needed to be very mindful of, that it would hopefully percolate up. And the good news was all of our conversations sort of reinforced a lot of both the challenges and the opportunities that folks have been thinking about. And then as a reminder, there's also a number of other town activities happening now that are going to have a big influence on what we're doing, and hopefully what we're doing is going to have a big influence on them. So the Council on Aging is in the midst of doing a sort of feasibility analysis of their existing property. Like I said, there's a chance they might move out of it, so they're trying to figure out, if we're going to stay put for the next 20 years, what's that going to involve? What do we need to do here? What's working, what's not working, to help inform that decision. There's a large-scale wastewater management project that's going on, and the Tea Time parcel was identified as potentially a site to do some of the recharge for that wastewater treatment. So that might take up a portion of the land here. Again, it's still too early to know where that's going to go. You'll see when we get to the Tea Time schemes, that's the big difference we looked at between sort of two schemes is, what if we don't have to worry about that? What if we maybe do have to worry about that a little bit? What might that impact look like? Certainly Route 6, the character of Route 6, a lot of people have brought up like, hey, I wouldn't be comfortable walking along the shoulder of Route 6. So the town is working with a number of consultants to look at what can be done about the character of Route 6. We're being mindful of both its current character and also being hopeful in the future that it can improve to a degree. But in either case, I think we're trying to find flexible solutions for those things. So again, all these things are ongoing. And in fact, we may be to the fall and some of these things are still sort of just ramping up. So they're all going to sort of talk back and forth and inform one another. We're trying to be as flexible as we can in the solutions we're coming up with to try to address these things. Last time we also talked a little about program elements. What are the sorts of things we're considering for these sites? And there's sort of four major categories. Top left would be sort of a civic program, a community center. There's been mention of the potential of a 50-meter pool. If we go down that path, how would that plug in? So there's a big civic component to these sites that we needed to be mindful of. Top right, housing precedents. We've talked a little bit about housing on all three of the sites. One of the things we wanted to make clear in the last session is when we talk about housing, we're not talking about big single-family homes. That's not appropriate here. But we're also not talking about huge apartment buildings either. That also doesn't feel like it's appropriate here. But we do have this whole range of housing types that can sort of slot in somewhere between those two things. Things like townhouses, right? A townhouse, you get a few more townhouses on a site than you do single-family homes, but maybe not quite as many as a multifamily building. Or a couple of these other types are, basically small apartment buildings, 4 to 6 to maybe 10 units in an apartment. So everything is meant to be still sort of village scaled, and that's what we were contemplating when we were talking about housing. Lower left, we also know there's going to be likely some commercial or even mixed use. So when we say mixed use, what we're referring to are buildings that have, some sort of commercial space in the ground floor, but then might have a few units above it, what some folks have called top-of-shop housing, right? We find these in historic villages around the Cape, and there's a good opportunity here to potentially incorporate some of that here as well. And then the last element is open space, in conjunction with the civic uses, and that there should be a variety of open spaces. We're not necessarily saying it's all going to be a soccer field, right? But there could be more formal uses, more informal uses, more active, more passive. We should try to find places for all of those things as they are appropriate to those other uses that are out there. And then we concluded last time, and we'll go through these in more detail again as we move forward, but we had 3 different sites. For each site, we had 3 different scenarios that we talked about last time. So we got through 9 different scenarios last time where we got you guys to show hands, what you were, which did you prefer, why not. It's the same information that we fed into the online survey that we had folks take. And just so as a case in point, the tea time parcel, these were just bubble diagrams meant to represent the uses we've been talking about here. And so one of the big things we talked through is, the big blue square is the community center. How did folks feel about the community center being pushed all the way at the back of the site? How did they feel about it being somewhere in the middle? How did they feel about it being somewhere in the front? That was the level of conversation we were having last time. And we got some really good input on those issues for all 3 sites. And so what we've done tonight is taken that input and try to actually put some real footprints down just to give you guys a real sense of what that looks like. This was very abstract, and I actually applauded the group for getting their heads around moving from thinking of these things as buildings and streets to uses and where they go on the site, right? So that was an important first step, but we're moving past that at this point. So at our last presentation, I think we had about 80 people. I'm not going to count everybody right now, but I bet we maybe had a few more folks, but it was comparable to this. It was a full house as it is tonight, so that's great. So we got that input on that night. And we also had a follow-up survey where we had an additional 218 people respond. Similarly, tonight, we're presenting to you 80 or so folks. We're also going to have a survey following up on this. I know Jeff was handing out the piece of paper that has our website. That's got everything on it. If you missed the first presentation and want to go back, we've posted our slides. There's a recording of it. You could go back and see what we talked about last time in more detail. But that's also where we're going to have the survey posted. Again, we'd love to get your feedback. As I joked with the people last time, you get to vote twice because you're here tonight giving your opinion, and then you can go take the online survey and basically give your opinion a second time. That's your reward for coming out on a beautiful night, right? So survey results. So as I mentioned, I'm going to pass it over to Jeff to share a little bit about the demographics of the 218 folks we heard from, but then he's also going to help sort of share the results site by site as we go through them.
Thank you, Jeremy, and hello, everyone. And I will try to be brief about this so you can get to what you're looking forward to, the next round of scenarios. So in terms of the people who responded to the survey, the 218 people, look around tonight. It's an older group that came out to the in-person meetings. We got a little bit more age diversity online. About 25% of the just a little over 25% of the respondents were under the age of 44, and I think we had 2 people under the age of 44 at the last in-person meeting. So that was encouraging. Interestingly enough, over 2/3 of the respondents were women. So way to go, ladies, for being civic-minded and filling out the survey. We appreciate it. Males were actually underrepresented in the survey. In terms of race and ethnicity, obviously largely white. Nope. And your relationship to Eastham, just not quite 3/4 were year-round residents, just over a quarter seasonal residents. A number of you are very civic-minded. About 7% of respondents noted they had an affiliation with an Eastham board or commission. Not as many people work in Eastham or own a business in Eastham, just a handful. In terms of income, this was also a little bit more diverse than the in-person meeting, but still skewed for households over $100,000 a year. Just as a reminder, and you'll be seeing this again tomorrow, as Jeremy mentioned. Oh, sure.
You're moving really quick. It's hard to...
Sorry, please. Anyone yell and stop me at any time.
That's just a really interesting number.
Yes, I thought that was interesting too, and why the 50 to 75,000 was more prominent than 75 to 999.
And there were people who did not answer that question. That was
Oh, absolutely.
So that should be reflected.
Yes.
Right?
So For all of these, and particularly for race and ethnicity, I think only about 80 of the 218 responded to that. A lot of people most people responded to the income, but not everyone. That's correct. In terms of the format, again, starting tomorrow morning, a new survey will be up, and we will, again, as Jeremy said, be asking all of you to go on. You'll be able to see pictures of the different scenarios, and again, rate them on a scale of 1 to 10, and provide additional thoughts. With that, let's dive into it. Do I have the next slide? Oh, you have the next slide. Okay.
Thank you.
Sure.
And again, just to make sure it was clear, on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 was a negative opinion of how it looked, 10 was a very positive opinion of how it looked, 5 was eh. And you'll be interested to keep track of that. We got a lot of 5s, which was kind of hard for us to try to translate. What do we do with a bunch of 5s? But thankfully not all were 5s, so that gave us some good direction.
Excuse me, I can't read the words on that. I mean, you said the blue was a community center, right?
That's right. So this was meant to be an example of the format of the survey, mostly to remind folks what the 1 through 10 meant. So we'll go through each of these schemes. I'll give you a little more information as we go through them again.
Jeremy?
Yes.
Quick little housekeeping note. We are recording the meeting this evening, so if you have a question or a comment, I don't know how Jeremy's wanting to handle them in general, but when you have those, we need you to speak into a microphone. So please allow us a minute to bring
That's
you a
right.
mic so that we can make sure those who can't be here in person can hear everything that's being asked and said. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the reminder, Lauren. Okay, so first we're going to talk about the Tea Time site, right? As a reminder, these were the recommendations of the Tea Time Committee that we used as the basis of everything we did. I think the important one is that first bullet. The focus should be on a community center building. That's the sort of main attraction here. That's what's getting everybody excited, right? It needs to meet the needs of all ages. It's going to be anchored by the Rec Department and Council on Aging, hopefully, as I mentioned previously. And again, there's this notion of this 50-meter pool, which is it's funny. People either totally want a pool or they totally don't want a pool. And so we're just providing, we've been including the potential of a pool. It may be any number of other things. You'll see how we've handled that in a minute, because I don't think we're going to get resolution on that anytime soon. So we wanted to make sure we were at least addressing the idea, but like I said, it's not set in stone one way or the other. They also suggested we should provide some housing on this site. As we all know, housing is one of the big issues that we have on the Cape overall. There's a real housing crisis, a real housing shortage. So wherever there's opportunities to include housing in a way that makes sense, we should be thinking about that. Include flex space that could be used for a number of things. The Tea Time Committee called it flex space. I will say I've just been referring to it generally as commercial. When we show those mixed-use buildings, the ground floor could be a restaurant. It could be a art store. It could be a realtor's office. It could be any number. It could be an office for a nonprofit, right? It doesn't always have to be, a Starbucks. Don't picture that it's like always Starbucks. But when we say commercial, and which I think they were reflecting in flex space, that's the idea there, that there could be things other than just the community center and housing here. We should have public access to the Cape Cod Rail Trail. If you're not aware, it literally runs right along the back edge of the site. We're hoping a lot of people come to the site via the rail trail and not by driving, so that's something we wanted to think about. And there should be an emphasis on creating a sort of walkable downtown village sort of feel, that whatever framework we come up with, it should be something that feels comfortable walking around in. So as I mentioned last time, there were 3 scenarios that we showed. And so we will, with each of them, I will talk a bit about the scenario, then I'll let Jeff talk about what we heard about it. So the first scenario we showed had the community center towards the back of the site. There's an electrical easement running all through here, so no matter what, we know we're going to have some kind of open space towards the back of the site. What that can be is a little bit to be determined. It is a utility easement, so we can't put a splash park in there. We can't put tall trees in there. It's got to be a negotiation with the utility. But we do think we'll be able to be clever about things like trails, maybe a nice little meadow, maybe some picnic areas. Things that are sort of lower intensity in use is a potential for that backspace. Towards the front on Route 6, we didn't think that made a lot of sense to imagine thinking of that as housing, right? It's a little bit tough to be, especially a ground floor unit right on Route 6. So we've been talking about that potentially being mixed use or commercial in character. And then in between, we showed a range of things. We showed the community center. The blue was the idea of this pool or something in the place of the pool. The yellow was meant to represent housing. The white was parking. Again, don't get too hung up on the sizes or where these things are located. It's going to get much more detailed as we move forward. But this was the first scenario that had the community center towards the back.
And in terms of what people thought about this scenario, again, this is one where the average was about 5. And so, the average didn't tell us a whole lot, so we broke it down by specifically what ratings people gave this scenario. And overall, definitely leaned negative. The most common rating was a 1, which again was very, very unfavorable. Positive ratings were very low. So I think the biggest concern here was that the community amenities being in the rear might feel like they're more private than a public amenity, and people might not be inclined to use it. So that was the big takeaway there.
So then again, quickly, the real difference with Scheme 2 is then, well, let's pull the community center forward a little bit. It's meant to be sort of figuratively the center. It's called a community center. What if we put it more central to the site? So we could still have mixed use along Route 6, the community center a little bit more readily accessible. Maybe we start pushing the housing a little bit further back, which probably makes sense because what's on the other side of the rail trail? Residential, right? So this was the second option that we presented.
And this was by far the highest rated, and I will say there was a huge diversity of responses, and as Jeremy said, a very strong set of responses on many different issues, but this averaged about an 8, which was actually very high. You can see the most common rating was 10, which was very, very positive. I think what people really liked was that the community center being in the middle, it felt more like it grounded the entire property. And people wanted to make sure that the mixed use in the front provided that village center feel and walkability into the project.
So then finally, the third scheme from last time said, let's push the community center all the way to the front of site where it's very visible, right? On Route 6, you'd see it. There it is. Love it. It's meant to represent your community, so why not make it as visible as it can be? That might limit the amount of mixed use we have on the site. Maybe that's okay. That might free up a little more space for some additional housing or maybe some additional open space in the back. Again, we were at the time trying to think more about where these pieces are going, less so than the size of the pieces. The size of the pieces was more about what we were going to talk about tonight. So this was the third scenario.
And by far the least preferred scenario, again, you can see very strong dislike with a lot of 1 votes, an average of about 5. And I think, again, the most common thing we heard about this was that people just felt uncomfortable having the community center right against Route 6. They felt it would be unwelcoming and feel unsafe.
Oh, and this is you too. Yeah.
So just to go over some of the common open-ended responses, and again, the open-ended responses really ran the gamut, and I think you'll see, based on the most common responses, that it's a lot of yin and yang here. So probably the most common response was let the community uses drive the program. It's community uses that you bought the property for, and anything else should be incidental, including housing. And then there are some folks who thought that there shouldn't be any housing on the site at all. On the flip side, slightly fewer people, but a very strong minority, thought there should be more housing on the site. Likewise, I would say just over a majority of people mentioned needing no need for commercial space or a more limited need for commercial and retail space on the site. But again, there was a very strong minority that said there was need for even more commercial and retail on the site. A number of people said they don't need any more outdoor recreation or at the same time need more indoor recreation. There were a number of people who were really focused on the sustainability of the site. And for some people that meant I don't really care what's built here so long as it's sustainable, meaning net zero buildings, solar panels, composting toilets, a place to grow food on the site, versus those who felt more that we should be leaving much or much more of the site as green space. There are a number of people who felt that the community uses should be visible and prominent from the street. And sort of the other end of that was that particularly for people who live in the neighborhood, they want to keep the noisy activities towards the front of the property and away from the residential neighborhoods to the rear. Again, as I already mentioned, there are a number of people that were concerned that having the recreational or community facilities right up against Route 6 might feel unsafe or unwelcoming. There were people who felt that if there is going to be housing on the site, it should be prioritized to the rear of the property. And then a general feeling, and whatever people's views were on these other things, that there was too much trying to happen on this space. And I think hopefully you'll see in the refined scenarios what this actually looks like when it's not just, these aren't just huge blocks of buildings. So hopefully we'll have addressed that concern. And then, yes, the swimming pool. We did not ask you questions about the swimming pool, but almost all of you brought it up, and it was pretty impressive how strong the feelings were on both sides. So just so you know, that's still on the table, but like Jeremy said, we are allowing for it in these scenarios, but not,
It's a seasonal pool?
it would be an indoor pool. We are just reserving space for it. Maybe.
Maybe indoor, maybe outdoor, to
We
be
don't know.
determined.
We've got the space set. And if I could, we would like to get through the description of tea time. Do we have any more slides before we? Yeah, where we'd like to get through the description of the scenarios, and then we will take questions just about tea time before we move on to the next site. And that, to Lauren's point, will give us an opportunity to make sure the microphone is passed around and everyone's questions are heard. So if you could hold your questions for just a few more minutes. Thank you so much.
So I have 2 kids, and if we were talking about going out to dinner, we give them 2 options. You know what happens, right? One picks one picks the other. Happens movies, happens everything. So you guys are living up to the same way my kids think about the world, right? So you're making our jobs tough. Actually, I will say it would be helpful if 100% of people picked A and not B, but you know it never happens, right? So I think what was important for us was to hear is that there's a broad spectrum of thinking on this. I think that gives us in some ways a little bit of flexibility. Again, we're trying to find a balance, right? The good news wasn't 100% of people saying it's got to be all housing, but at the same time saying it's got to be all community use, right? That's an impossible thing for us to achieve. So I think the good news is what we're taking away from this is try to find the right balance, right? It's a little bit of this, a little bit of that. How does it all come together and make something kind of special and wonderful? So if you recall, this was scenario 2. This is the one that got the sort of average of an 8 score. So this is what we thought was probably a good starting point for what we came up with. The one critique I had of this scheme, and it came out in some of the people's responses, was make sure the community center doesn't look like it's sort of hidden, like that it's behind the mixed use, that you got to know that you got to take a turn to get back in there. So you'll see in the scheme I do in a second, I tried to find a happy ground between it being on 6A where it's visible and not so far back that it's not visible. So this is the first scenario that we're going to show you guys. So we tried to make the colors of the buildings comparable to the uses, to the bubbles and diagrams, things that we were showing previously. Here, front and center is a community center, right? But instead of it being right on Route 6, we kind of pulled it back. We left a little bit of a green space in the front. I see this as a very sort of, think of like a memorial park, right? Where you have the flagpoles and you have the things. You're not necessarily meant to go there and spend a lot of time there, but visually it can be quite wonderful. It can be quite representational of a number of things. And it really sets up the community center in this very sort of civic way. It's not unlike some of the, like the town hall and some of the civic buildings you guys do have in further south. They have a presence on the street, but that doesn't necessarily mean they have to be right up on the street, right? So that's what we were attempting to do with the community center. We drew a community center that was roughly 25,000 square feet. We heard it's probably going to be between 20 and 30. So we said, let's try to show one that's somewhere in the middle. Might be a little bit bigger, might be a little bit smaller. Plan would have to flex a little bit one way or the other as a result. Continuing behind the community center, we included a large open space area. If you see that black dashed line, that's the size of a 50-meter pool. So, if we have a pool, that could be where the pool is. If we don't have a pool, there's a number of other ideas out on the table that I think are equally kind of wonderful. What about a skating pond? What about a splash park for younger kids? What if you left it open as a field that you could bring out and set up tents and host other kind of events, right? The point is we have a space, and whether it's a pool or not, it can be a civic space, right? It can be a community space. So it makes sense to have that adjacent to the community center itself. Continuing through at the back, we have a few other little green spaces. Thought maybe it'd be great to have some playgrounds. I will say one of the things we always worry about when the folks that are turning out trend one way or the other in terms of your demographic, there's not a lot of young families out saying, hey, we just need places for the kids to play, right? So that's why, even though we're not hearing it come up, we know it's out there to a degree. And we take that confidence from seeing the survey, the respondents. That's why we appreciate when you guys fill out those forms. We get a sense of whether or not we're getting a little bit of a skewed opinion or not, and we try to adjust a little bit accordingly. The point is there's plenty of space here as well for some additional sort of civic needs. Flanking either side of that, I should also point out, we've also suggested there should be a bus stop added here. I don't think there's currently a bus stop here, but if you're going to put this sort of program in, it makes a lot of sense to have a bus stop. We provided a little sort of drop-off area, whether it's here or here or here at the end of the day, figure it out. But we think it's important to consider including a bus stop here, and I think the Tea Time group actually recommended that as well. So flanking on either side of this, we've included a small commercial building. So we have one on either side. So the idea is that you start to really create this little set piece. It really is sort of village feeling. If you look up and down the road, these buildings are similar in scale to the other sorts of things that you find up and down along this road. It's only a 4,000 square foot footprint, so it's not an enormous building. But that's a good sized building. One of those could host like a really big restaurant, like a really nice restaurant, or it could be subdivided into a number of smaller other uses. Like I said, that's that flex space. Maybe it goes office, maybe it goes any number of ways. But the hope would be that those would be uses that could really benefit from being adjacent to the community center, right? Like you might come here and park, use the community center, go get a coffee, go on your way, or whatever the case might be, right? And that's what's going to create that sort of energy and that sort of village feel. As you move further into the site, the yellow buildings are housing. And so in this case, we're showing a combination of townhouses, those little manor houses, so those maybe have 3 or 4 apartments in them. They could have their own parking sort of tucked away in the back so they don't have to worry about people taking what's supposed to be their parking spot. But really what they're doing, all their fronts, they all have front porches, they're helping frame that space. So it really does have sort of a real communal feel, right? They could be out on their porch watching the things happen across the way. They're there 24 hours a day, making sure it's safe and wonderful and everything's cool. And we're providing additional housing that we need. Now, the town suggested maybe we think about something like 30 to 35 units here. So that's what this includes. This is, I think our tally was like 31 to 37. But so there's some housing. We're trying not to overwhelm it with housing. We're trying to balance it amongst a couple of other things. And in this scheme, here's the utility easement. So we really tried to push back kind of as far as we thought made sense, not going into the easement. And for this one, we actually assume that whatever program we're proposing has to handle its own stormwater on its own site. So it would need an area for that septic. The great news is we have this nice little tucked away corner that would really be maybe difficult to try to use any other way. So this is sort of a self-sustained site, if you will, in wastewater terms. That said, both the septic area and the utility easement, like I said, I think there could still be some sort of uses to those. They won't be intensive uses. We're not going to put a baseball field back there. But there could be any number of things, like I mentioned earlier, trails, community gardens, other things that might work in some of those sorts of spaces. So we're trying to take advantage of much of the land as we can, but we're also trying to be mindful of not putting the most active thing right here, right adjacent to the residential neighborhood, right? So it should be most active here, a little bit less active here, pretty quiet when you get here, and really quiet here, other than the fact that you're trying to connect and get back out to the rail trail. So this was the first scheme that we did for this site. If you'll recall, I mentioned earlier that there was also the potential that some of the site might be needed for wastewater treatment recharge. So what we said is, okay, how much of this can we dial back to incorporate some land for wastewater recharge, but still have the critical mass of sort of a village feel? Oh, before I get to that, I forgot I had a few more visuals to help you understand what these blocks look like, right? So here on the main street, we're talking about commercial. We're talking about the scale of a small corner store, 1-story sort of structure. Could still incorporate things like porches that make it sort of wonderful, charming. The community center itself, again, it could go any number of ways, but it's going to be a sort of single story, although a large single story sort of civic structure in the center. The residential types we're showing, again, townhouses, maybe 3 or 4 townhouses attached. The manor houses, again, just meant to be 3 or 4 apartments in those buildings. So these aren't huge buildings. And the hope is that between all of these things, you can see that, this is meant to feel like an Eastham village sort of scale. We're not trying to blow it up and do a mall here, right? In terms of the open spaces, again, we'll have some that are maybe a little more formal, a little more civic, maybe, statuary, playgrounds, all those sorts of things. But even at the back, we've got these areas we could have more informal open spaces, walking trails, et cetera. So again, this is just meant to show you the sort of range of how the scale and feel of some of those things might be. Again, this might go any number of ways, but that's what we're trying to sort of show you here as a visualization of how these things come together. So again, all in a 25,000 square foot community center, about 8,000 square feet of commercial in the two buildings. Between all the residential, you're looking at about 30 to 37 units, and the parking they require. I also want to point out, because in the next scheme we're going to lose this, flex parking. With this network of this loop road we have and some of the parking we have off of it, in addition to what we think we would need for those uses, we tried to also include another 35 or so spaces just for flexibility. What if both of these things end up being restaurants? They're probably going to need more parking than what we potentially accommodated. Or what if we want to host a little craft show here on a Thursday evening? We're going to want a few more parking spaces out there, right? But we tried to incorporate those in a way where, you know, we tried to avoid big, large, dedicated parking fields, right? The idea was to distribute it around, tuck it in, make it feel like it belongs right off of the street. We had a few little lots tucked off just next to those commercial buildings. Again, if it's a restaurant, it does kind of want its own little dedicated parking there. So in this scheme, we were able to provide about, call it 35 spaces of flex parking in addition to what we were accommodating for. So how am I doing on time? Keep moving. So this is the alternative. And so what we did here was we truncated, you see what we did? We stole this whole back area for wastewater treatment recharge. The front is still fairly similar. You get you still have some townhouses and manor houses. You still have, it's a little harder to make out, that black dashed area is still there. So in some ways it's a similar program, and we lost kind of like the little playground spaces, not to say we couldn't figure out how to do a playground. We really had to kind of compress ourselves into the front sort of 2/3 of the site. And to make sure we didn't lose too many housing units, what we actually propose now is that these two buildings, instead of being that sort of one-story commercial building, they go to mixed use. So we put some top-of-shop units on top of them. We don't necessarily lose residential units. It does mean these buildings are now more of a sort of, well, I'll go to it, more of a 2.5-story sort of scale. So we wanted to try to figure out, could we still provide a similar program in less space? The answer is almost, right? So we lost some of the formal playground spaces. We still have, even in this wastewater treatment recharge area, like I said, there's still some uses we can put out there. It's not just going to be an empty field, but you're limited. You can't put something like a playground that has, stuff sticking into the ground. That doesn't work particularly well with, wastewater treatment areas. I'm going to take opinions and questions in a minute on these. Is that okay? And we lost the flex parking. There's no longer a line item right there, right? So at the moment, we kind of have exactly the parking that we might need. Again, it's a little bit uncertain. Maybe the community center needs more or less. A lot of that is still to be resolved. But my point is, when you start trying to compress things into smaller and smaller areas, it's going to start creating some constraints. Maybe these both can't be restaurants now because we don't have that little bit of extra flexibility built into it. But we know that there's a real need for this wastewater treatment area. Again, we're not sure when we're going to learn how much it needs to be. It's likely it's going to need to be in multiple sites around the town, so this might be one of the areas for consideration. So I think the good news is if you're careful about how much you do, I still think you can create a pretty wonderful little there with a critical mass, with some housing, some commercial, some community center space. It's just going to be not as flexible, obviously, if you had just a little bit more land to play with. So those are the two schemes we generated for discussion tonight. Again, what we're trying to do is give you guys, the first one was so abstract, and now we're trying to give you a sense of what these things really look like. This isn't the final plan. It's just meant to start, when we say 30 units on the site, what does that mean? What does that look like? We're trying to start giving you guys a sense of that. So with that, I'd love to get your input. I'm going to let Roz go first because she has a... Oh yeah, microphones, please.
Thank you. The second one, can I call that the second one?
Sure, yeah.
All right. So the second one takes the green that's right adjacent to the first one, community center, and puts it away from the community center and puts parking between the community center and the green, which is bizarre. The green should come closer to the community center and the parking should go over near the wastewater, blah, blah, blah. The other thing is, in the first scheme, if I'm reading it correctly, and I may not be, it looks like an awful lot of road pavement. Is that true? I mean, it's all pavement in there.
Yeah, I mean, this would be the road
why is that?
Well, you need to be able to get in and around the site. You need to be able to access the...
But, I mean, isn't there two access points for the housing? Isn't that pavement in the back of the house and pavement in the front of the house?
Yeah, so that's where the residential units would potentially park, so that they can get off of the public area.
Yeah, but so then there's a road there. Why do you need a road? I mean, it just looks awfully roady to me.
I will say that if you're going to have cars here, you're going to have parking and roads here. And so one of the things we tried to do was to be clever about not doing roads and big parking lots. So honestly, I was trying to be as efficient as possible with some of those things. It is one of the challenges, right? I still think this could be a wonderful walkable sort of place.
Can you describe that, the houses that have the roads in the front and the back?
Yeah.
You look out the window and what do you see, a road and parking?
So it's kind of like, I don't know, I know in Eastham you guys don't have like parking lanes or alleys. You know, there are places in the world where residents have their own parking lane in the back and you kind of park in your backyard versus having a front porch on the front that's facing out to the larger community. Again, this is a denser form of housing. This is not the single-family housing that Eastham has
No, I know, but
everywhere else, right?
But is it true that you look out the back of your house and you see parking, and you look out the front of your house and you see parking? I mean,
We tried to create, you'd have a little backyard, you'd have a patio, you'd have landscaping, but yeah. So here's what I wanted to do is I'm going to start because I'm going to do a show of hands. If folks feel strongly one way or the other, you don't have to necessarily feel strongly on the other because I know they're very similar, but I'm just curious to see. And then I'm going to give folks a chance to sort of weigh in on, everybody feels like they've got just that one question real quick.
This is a fun construction.
Yeah, you need the microphone.
Now, is there any specific reason to recharge? Please hold the question. We got the microphone.
You identify the speakers?
Jim Pagos. Is there any particular reason the recharge station needs to be part of this space?
Not necessarily, which is why we did one scheme where it's not on the site and did one where it
So,
is on the site.
just say a little bit about the what do we need for a recharge station? What is it?
So again, that's one of those ongoing efforts that's running at the same time as ours. They're very early on. They've only done some very initial calculations. One of their calculations said they would need this whole site to do all of the recharge for is it the salt pond? I'm trying to remember, I'm going to say the wrong thing here. The thing that's driving a need for a wastewater treatment facility. Jackie, do you want to speak to
I
that?
can grab it, Jeremy.
Okay, thank you.
So we just went with the consultants today. We're looking at 4 discrete sites, 4 separate sites, town-owned properties. The primary one is the current DPW site. Okay, that would be our first choice for treatment and some recharge. We need a secondary site for recharge. And the choices are all, unfortunately, either in our Zone 2 of the water system or in places that are absolutely untouched. So we're looking for tea time to be a secondary recharge spot to allow us to have future capacity for, and it would be the treated effluent. So it would be after it's gone through all of its intensive treatment, and the standard for that is 3 milligrams of nitrate or milliliters of nitrate or less. So a lot less than is in your backyard right now in your septic system, and that water would be released. You can do pervious pavement, you can do football fields, softball fields, certain types of gardens. As Jeremy said, we can't put down anything that we couldn't dig up if we needed to repair what's underneath. That's it. We're
So-
going to have wastewater somewhere, we just have to decide where. And right now, we're waiting for the next few months, we're waiting to see what the perk tests and other tests are going to tell us about what the best spots are. So this may not even be a good spot, but we don't know that yet. So I asked them to plan it in.
And that's where part of what we were trying to do is say, how far could we take that before it's going to get tough, right? If you took half of the site for wastewater recharge, you're going to have a community center and a wastewater recharge area. You're not necessarily going to have enough room for some commercial, some housing, trying to create that mixed-use village character. And that might be okay if that's where it comes, right? All this stuff is about finding a balance, but...
I really don't understand the scientific... I don't know what the scientific reason for using this space, but it seems when we're trying to make a community area, there ought to be some other space in the town if it doesn't create a problem. That's just my reaction.
So thank you. So I think that's kind of what we're going for. I think if the community feels like that's a big mistake here, that's helpful, I think, for Jackie and the team to understand. If people think, oh, it's great to see that we could still provide something wonderful here, as long as we're careful about how far we go, that's a useful thing to understand too. I'm still even curious, do you guys like where the community center is? Do we get that right? Do we get that wrong? I think those are some of the things we want to talk a little bit about as well. Yes, sir, you've had your hands.
This looks all well and good, either Plan A or B, but I haven't heard anything mentioned about traffic control and access and egress onto Route 6. I mean, in the summer, we all know what the traffic is like. Trying to take a left turn on Route 6 is like taking your own life in your hands. So I'm not hearing anything about that issue.
Yeah, so I will say that, again, that one of the other ongoing efforts that's happening concurrent to ours is the Route 6 study about what's feasible, what's possible. Again, part of what's beneficial is if we tell them, hey, this is what we're thinking about here. Right now, it's just an empty field, right? So what we're trying to do is say, hey, we're trying to do something here. Help us understand how to make that work. I'm not a traffic engineer, so I'm not certainly going to be the one that gives you the answer of how that goes. I will say there's a reason we tried to limit it to 2 curb cuts and didn't do like 40.
But isn't that an issue that needs to be addressed right up front?
Jeremy, I can address this question, and then I
Yeah.
think we do need to move on to what Jeremy had proposed for the next steps with a show of hands on each concept, and then we can take additional comments. But I'll address your question briefly. As Jeremy mentioned prior, we do have an ongoing effort to look at Route 6, and it includes this area. We have just submitted a $1 million grant to the state that would fund design and engineering for this section of Route 6. Currently, this is in a feasibility stage, though, and so we have an engineering team that is looking at possible solutions, and we'll be bringing some more information to the public about that soon. The important thing to note is that neither one can happen without the other. They both have to move forward together, because whatever uses are being cited, whatever kind of intensity of use is happening on this property needs to influence the Route 6 design, and vice versa. The Route 6 design has to complement what's being proposed here. So to answer your question, it couldn't happen before until we have a plan for how we want to use this property. So they are going to move together, and hopefully that addresses your question. And then I'm going to give it to Jeremy so we can do our show of hands.
So I'm going to do a show of hands. I've decided on 4 categories. You ready? So you got to pay attention. First is going to be I prefer the scheme on the left. Second's going to be I prefer the scheme on the right. Third's going to be I'm happy either way. Option number 4 is I'm unhappy either way. That's how I'm going to try to do it. Okay, we're going to see it because we're not really sort of picking A or B in a way, but I'm just kind of curious to sort of take the temperature of the room. So first up, show of hands, who likes and prefers A over B? Okay, I'm not going to count hands either, but that's a lot of hands, so that's really helpful. How many folks prefer B over A? Got a few folks, great, understanding the trade-offs there, wonderful. How many folks, show of hands, are happy either way? A couple folks happy either way. How many folks are completely unhappy with either one of these options? We missed the boat. Okay, so I want to start with the positives because that's how I usually roll. So if you want to raise your hand and just share a quick comment about what you think we've done right with A or B or both, that would be really useful. Then we'll go to what you think we didn't get right, and we've got 2 more sites to go to, right? So I want to be careful that we don't spend all night just on this one.
One thing I really appreciate is that you broke up the parking lots. I mean, the last month, the parking lots were big squares in the design, and I really like the way you broke up the parking lots. And I think the community center is in an ideal location.
Great, thank you. Somebody else? I'll get you a microphone. Come in.
Hi, Joan Lockhart. I just think that there are not enough parking spaces in either design if we want this to be a real hub for the community with things that go on all the time. And although I didn't like the big blocks of parking, people are going to be backing out of parking spaces all over the place here. That makes it less walkable. So parking to me needs to be reworked.
Okay, thank you. How about the positives? Anybody for a positive thing? And I promise we'll have time for the negatives too, but maybe a few doors back.
Hi, I'm Nancy Benben. I really, first of all, appreciate all the work and how much you've taken into all of the feedback that you've heard. It's hard for me to imagine how you did that, so I'm really impressed. I really like how you have interspersed the housing as a almost a border of this, and the different types of housing that you've included here. I think it's a really, really nice balance in Scheme A. So I'm really appreciative of what you've done, and I think it's terrific, the housing in particular, so thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Let's do maybe two more on the positive side.
My name is Linda Reed. My name is Linda Reed, and I think that Plan A is lovely. One thing I'm wondering, to sort of add on to Joan Lockhart's comment, what can we do with that easement? Can we put a parking lot in the easement? Can we do septic under those power lines? Can we use that land? I know we can't build anything there.
Yeah, we're pretty sure septic's a no-go. I'm pretty sure parking's probably a no-go. I mean, usually with those easements, the reason there's an easement is they need to be able to service their lines, and they're worried about something falling on their lines or falling on something, or something hitting their lines, right? So they're usually very defensive of their easements. So I think in this case, they're aware that this is kind of a special place, so the town will work with them and fight hard to get some use in there. But I will also suggest that for the folks that live just beyond those lines, the less there is in there, probably the happier they are. So again, I think we're going to be trying to find a balance between, we don't need to go crazy here. We don't have to put everything we can possibly dream on this site either, right? We got to find the right balance of what's feasible. We still have 2 other sites to talk about, remember. So we've got some other opportunities for some kind of interesting things to happen. So that's where we're trying to set expectations kind of reasonably, that we can probably do something in those areas, but don't think suddenly the pool goes under there, and that, that suddenly that solves a lot of the other things we're trying to solve for. So let's go one more. We'll do one more in the back.
The issue with the easement and with the grounding and all that stuff under there, it just becomes a issue with development and easement for one. My positive on B is I work in a community right now where we're going through wastewater, and we are basically finding that there are no spaces in town easy to put wastewater recharge, and we're struggling. And it's becoming down to checkerboarding half-acre lots and putting wastewater between houses and doing things that the state is mandating us to do. So I'm saying if we have an ability to somehow incorporate wastewater and incorporate areas that may be utilized for wastewater, it's good planning, because you do not want to be in a situation where the state mandates you do something, find an area, and then you do not like where it is. This is an area where there's a lot of property, a lot of ability to put some recharge in there, or reserve it for some recharge and use it as a natural space instead of developing it and finding yourself behind a wall. So that's my comment.
That's great, thank you. So let's go ahead and switch then. Now it's things that you're concerned about, things that you don't think are quite working out, places that you think that we should rethink something. Show of hands, we'll come around and talk to you. Go ahead, if you've got a mic.
Thank you. I like the other lady said, this is such a complex discussion, and there's so many competing interests. It's just amazing that you've been able to come up with such good suggestions. My only comment is that according to the housing production plan, we need 325 units of housing. So I'm not sure where the number 30 to 35 came from, but that's not what's in the housing production plan. And the strategic plan, for that matter. So I would just encourage you to be more creative about how to get more housing on the site. I love the community center. No, I'm talking respectfully. I get to say my piece. That's what's in the plans, and those plans were adopted by the community.
Yep.
So that's my only comment. But I think the mix that you've created here is really looks like what we wanted. I think what we want it to look like.
Great, thank you. And I will say I'm a big housing advocate too. I'd love to keep tucking in more. I do think as we go over the summer, we're going to keep talking to the town about what is the appropriate level. Again, when you say more housing, you get a groan. You say less housing, you get a groan. Again, we know we're trying to balance all these things out. That was a number that is a little bit arbitrary, but is also a number that in other conversations with the community was about what people were sort of comfortable with. Again, in my mind, it's a little bit arbitrary. That's why for us, what's more important is showing what does 35 houses look like? Like, it is useful, right? It's better than no houses, and if you want to do more, how do you address that? So So again, I think that's one of the specific number of units I think is still going to be a little bit of an ongoing conversation, but that was what we thought was going to be a sort of a happy medium between the various things we're hearing, so.
And Jeremy, I just want to address too that in the approach to this project, we have tried to look at this as one piece of the puzzle. So in thinking, back to the original acquisition of this property and what the community wanted, didn't want on this property, trying to honor that, but also looking at the housing production goals and trying to think of how this can be one piece of that puzzle toward getting us to the target numbers that we've set. And so I think you'll see as we go through the additional sites, we tried to think of this holistically across the 3 sites of number of housing units versus just trying to position as many units of housing on one site as possible.
In the back, maybe if there's actually we'll go over here because there's a mic here if you want to start transitioning, but we'll start here.
Hi, thanks, Jerry Magid, Felon Road. First of all, I want to compliment the town and you guys on the philosophy behind the whole thing. I think it's, walkability and mixed use is a fantastic way to go. Personally, I was hoping to see more mixed use. I would love to see more of the mixed use commercial buildings. When I think of a downtown, which was sort of what I thought we were trying to create here, it's like it's got stores with houses over it, because that's more public, and it still provides the housing, but I don't see myself going into, a housing area where there's just a bunch of houses. That seems like a private thing, where if it's mixed use, then, there's a little store tucked over here, I want to go to it, and, I would like to see a lot more of that mixed use with the commercial and the housing above it than the private houses. I think it's a much more welcoming spot, and makes it feel more like a village downtown to have that mix. And then the final thing I would say is, I'm not crazy about a pool, but I would like to see a park with a water element in it, like a fountain or something that's a community place to gather. So other than that, I think this is a great start, and look forward to where it develops.
Great, thank you. And I will say, hopefully when we get to the town center site, you'll feel a little better, because that one's got much more of that kind of mixed use potential, but thank you, it's a good point. We're already at 6:30, okay. So I'm gonna keep moving. Great news. For those of you that didn't get to weigh in, online survey, right? You can go there, you can give us your comments. You're not gonna do it? You're not convinced? You want one last quick comment? We need a mic up here though, real quick, sorry.
So just a couple of short things. One is the whole recharge thing is like a brand new thing that's being introduced tonight. So that's kind of I think, not a great way to say. I don't know what people's real feeling will be once that whole issue is discussed. But to all of a sudden throw it on tea time, I think was a little funky. The other thing is, I don't think you keep referencing restaurants. I think that's not an allowed use in that area, so that's kind of a weird conversation. And I'm not sure when you reference things like playground and things like that, that you're looking at what's behind Town Hall and that area, or the windmill area. So we have other areas in town, other green areas in town. It's not just these 3 parcels, really, when we talk about things. And the last thing I would say that I've brought up a few times in surveys is that unless that pool is going to generate money, I think there needs to be some anchor business in that area that's going to help defray the cost of a community center for the residents. Otherwise, we're carrying a lot of the cost. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. All right, so let's keep moving. If I keep taking one more, we're never going to get to the end, and I don't want to sort of lose the other sites too, because this is just the first of 3. So thank you. Let's keep going. Next up, Town Center Plaza. Quick reminder of what we heard from the Tea Time Committee. There are 6 current businesses out there. They should be retained. We need to have a real plan for how they could stick around if they so choose. One of the things we introduced to some of those businesses was if we incorporated a little bit of commercial space up at the Tea Time site, maybe there's a chance they could move there if that made more sense for them. So I think in the end, we're actually going to be providing a few more opportunities or options for them, which is great. But again, we have to be mindful of the 6 current businesses. We don't want to displace anybody unnecessarily. In addition to the 6, if possible, create additional retail, restaurant, entrepreneurial space. The top-of-shop housing idea I talked about earlier, this could be a potential site to do some mixed use, do some units above the commercial spaces. And again, like the other one, let's try to make sure it has sort of a walkable downtown village sort of character and feel. Obviously, it's a site that's about half as big, so it's not going to be quite as grand a village as the other one could potentially be, but still that notion of how do you make it walkable, how do you make it somewhere you want to park and get out of your car and hang out for a while is important. There were 3 schemes that we shared last time here. Again, we'll go through each of these in a little bit more actually, no, I'm going to try to go through the detail here so that when it gets to Jeff, he can just go survey result, survey result, survey result. We had 3 scenarios out here. The first said, let's make sure we have, I know it's hard, the existing stuff's ghosted underneath. The idea was the existing stuff that's out there, let's push it forward and consolidate it in more of a village setup. Let's shift the parking to the back so it's not sort of an unsightly thing you see along Route 6. Plus, we can do it much more efficiently than it is out there now. Currently, it's, I don't know who laid that thing out. It's crazy. And then we said, let's try to make sure, though, that we still keep some sort of green buffer. There's a bunch of existing trees at the back of the site. We need to keep as much of that in place as we can because there are residential units right up to the back of this, right? There's not a rail trail. There's not a utility easement. Those residences are right up on that line. So we need to be mindful of how we create a little bit of separation for those. So that was kind of scheme number 1. Scheme number 2, we said, well, instead of it just being commercial, wouldn't it be wonderful if it could be mixed use? We could incorporate some of this top-of-shop housing. It's very subtle. We tried to suggest just keep in mind that as we put more uses into the space, we need more parking for that. So we very subtly made the white bubble a little bit bigger and the red bubble a little bit smaller. It's sort of a fine-grained thing, but we just wanted to talk through the reality of you can't just add uses without also respecting the fact that you need to add parking, infrastructure, trash, all the other things that go along with it. And then the really revolutionary idea that at least got a lot of support with the group that was here a month ago was, what if we actually detach the housing from some of the mixed use and actually put some housing at the back of the site as a transition, as a buffer to the residential behind it? Pointed out the big trade-off there is that you're going to have even less space available for the mixed use components, the commercial components. We might find ourselves not able to provide all the commercial space that's out there now. That was one of our big charges. So these were the 3 schemes that we shared, got people's opinions in the last meeting, and then the online survey results is what I'm going to let Jeff talk you through. The purple was the thing that was meant to confuse everybody.
Okay, would you like to spend one minute talking about pad purple? Yeah.
Okay. So one of the things we recognize is because there is a Cumberland Farms gas station auto-centric extraordinaire thing on the corner, that the first thing was going to have to live between 2 worlds. On one side, it was going to be backing up to a fairly auto-intensive use. On the other side, we wanted to try to make it a little bit more of the transition into the mixed-use village. We couldn't come up with a good word for it. I used pad, and that's like the worst thing I could have used for it. I still don't know how to, I'm trying to describe it, but I don't know how to label it. But we also know there's an existing tenant out there currently, I'll just say the liquor store, that very much is like, look, we're auto intense. You pull up, you buy a bunch of booze, you walk right out. You don't walk, a quarter mile with a box full of booze. We need to have that kind of almost car-like character. So the idea was that at that corner, if we were going to do something that had that, that's where we would do it. And so we included it in all 3 scenarios. I think you'll see how we addressed it. So I kind of wish I'd never even called it out. It was me kind of overthinking the problem and just confusing matters. So I apologize. So.
Thank you, Jeremy. I was actually, we got a lot of questions about what pad retail meant in the survey. So scenario 1, very, very much split, even though 10, so positive was the most common response. The average was, again, 5, because there were nearly as many who felt very strongly on the other end of the scale. I think a lot of people felt that the open space being along Route 6, again, was going to be unwelcoming, unsafe. And there were a number of people who felt that they wanted at least some housing on this site and didn't appreciate that there really wasn't much or any in this scenario. So for the second scenario, this was more positive, but still people were, I think, concerned about the location of the open space. You see we're bump up to about a 6 on average. Yay, we're moving along. And there were a number of people who were concerned about that big white bubble that represented too much parking and could be better utilized either for commercial or housing or open space, but not parking. So I think that large parking area was a turnoff for a number of people. And then scenario number 3, by far the most preferred scenario. Again, the average was 6+. because we still had a number of folks who were not a fan of this one at all, but by and large, this had the most positive responses, and I think people appreciated that the open space being in the middle would be more usable, and there are a number of people who specifically said they appreciated the housing units in the rear. In terms of some of the most common open-ended responses, again, that pad retail, so hopefully we've addressed that tonight. We'll come up with a new label.
I'm going to open a store there called Pad.
Oh. And people were, in general, very supportive of mixed use at this location. Even people who were not necessarily very supportive of mixed use at tea time and said as much, but did want to see housing here. And then a number of people also, again, supported housing in the rear. I think there were a lot of comments here that were like, I'm cool with this so long as it's designed well. So a lot of comments about make it more walkable, make it more bikeable, give it that Cape Cod style architecture feeling, which of course we're not quite to that level yet, but we hear you. And then other people wanted to have more of an emphasis on green space. And again, I mentioned that people felt that green space right up along Route 6, I mean, again, unless it was used as a buffer, would not really be very utilized by people. And then, again, as we've already heard tonight, there are ongoing concerns about curb cuts and circulation. So a lot of those more general issues outside of the design scheme of the property came out in those common open-ended responses.
Thank you, Jeff. That was much more efficient. Sorry we didn't do that the first time. So we looked at two different schemes here now, and these are a little bit more different than the previous two that we showed, right? So the first one we looked at, again, as you noticed too, we didn't get sort of an overwhelming majority support on one or the other, which we get. It's really hard to understand what those diagrams mean and what they're trying to suggest. So we looked at two different options for the site based on the commentary we heard. The first one plays off of this one, the idea of doing mixed use in the front, parking in the back, still providing an open space buffer, but being mindful of what that open space is and how it operates. So this is Scheme A, which we're just calling the mixed use village. What we've done is we've created a series of smaller buildings, very village scale-like, that wrap their way around that open space. So that open space isn't necessarily sort of just hanging out on Route 6. It's not just sort of the front yards of these things that no one will ever use. The idea is that the buildings themselves start to frame that. So similarly on a smaller scale to what we were talking about on tea time, kind of creating a room, you're kind of creating a place there in between these buildings. That also suggests we could have lots of little outdoor seating areas, etc. The one thing I think it does suggest is we have to be very mindful of how we treat that edge. We did incorporate, there's already a bus stop out there now. Most of you might not even know that because it's just a signpost that I think has been graffitied over. But we want to really incorporate a little pull-off, a little kiosk, make it something wonderful, make people aware that it's here. And that could be a way that people could come and go. I will say I've seen a lot of places in New England successfully treat an edge like this with something as simple as a 2-foot, 3-foot stone wall. It's a visual barrier. We don't imagine a car is going to suddenly come over it. If you've got a runner, like Lauren said one of her kids is, they get to the wall, but at least they don't end up directly out on Route 6. So there's ways of treating those edges with landscape, with other things, so that it doesn't feel like you're completely exposed. But the real idea is primarily people are kind of a little bit further into it, right? That's where the activity is. That's where the buildings are. We have to provide access here. There's an easement with the Cumberland Farms so they can come and go. So again, I think in this first corner, you could imagine something like a liquor store could go in this location and still have readily available parking. It's also probably not a great location for top of shop housing so that you're not looking out at the gas pumps all night, right? We could probably incorporate that a little bit more readily in some of the other buildings, but maybe not so much at that corner. You can see the parking is generally behind. We can still make our way around and through the site. Currently, there's an access here with the bank. The bank also has some parking back here. So there's a couple of ways to kind of move around and through here, which is good. But the hope is when you arrive, you park, you walk in, you spend some time in the really wonderful part of it, in the center of it. Give you a sense of what those things look like. Again, here with the sort of single-story commercial, again, using the same imagery. Just a simple little structure of something here. Imagine that says the liquor store, maybe, if that's what ends up happening there. The mixed-use buildings, commercial below with some top shop housing above. And really the character of this space, it's not a big wide open field, right? It's it's walkways, it's seating areas, it's shade trees, it's picnic tables, it's front doors to the various commercial spaces. So it's more about somewhere you kind of inhabit and you end up being for a little while. I could imagine this could be somewhere where maybe you host like a reading hour or something, right? There's not going to be grand events here, but it could still be a wonderful space that could get used all day long, right? Supporting these businesses and giving them places to have, there could be tables and chairs out in these areas, right? Outdoor seating's become a big thing for us again, thankfully. So that's what we were showing here. We're providing a total of 16,000 square feet-ish of commercial on the ground floor of these. The existing today, I think, is around 13,000. So this delivers on the tea time suggestions of enough for the 6 that are there, plus, if we can. This also delivers on the top-of-shop housing idea. You'll see we also tried to preserved a lot of the existing tree stand along the back of the site to try to help create that buffer. So we didn't, push the development, push the parking right up to the edge. We actually left a pretty decent buffer along that edge. And so that's scheme A. And, depending on how big the units are and whether we do 2 stories or 2.5 stories, I think we could do something like 15 to 25 units in those top-of-shop houses. So again, that's helpful. That's helping, right? So the other one we looked at, because again there was some support, especially in the in-person session, less so than in the survey, was this idea of, well, what if we put some housing at the back of the site instead of necessarily putting as much up in the front? That said, we also still wanted to be mindful of the let's not lose commercial space out here. So what we ended up discovering was that when we took up some of the space that was formerly parking area, right, for the other scheme, because we're no longer stacking these things, we're putting them side by side, we can still provide, call it 10 townhouses along the back, which creates a really nice separation for these. But because we have a little bit less parking, we have to have a little bit less program. Now, I still think we could create a really cool little commercial village. This one has roughly the same square footage as what's out there today, but now it's still in this compact, walkable little village character feel. So again, I think you could still create this kind of wonderful environment. It's just going to be commercial uses around the edge. It's not going to also have the residential above the shops, but there are the residences that live just behind the shops. So I think the big trade-off here is that you end up with a little bit less commercial, you end up with a little bit less residential. You also end up with a little less scale, right? The buildings on the street are only a story instead of 2.5 stories. I think that's a reasonable trade-off, but this is sort of when you separate the housing from the commercial, it takes up space, right? So something's got to give, something's got to go. And so what we ended up doing was saying, let's make sure we still have the same amount of retail space out there as there is now, so we don't lose anybody, versus taking even more away and going to a few little mixed-use buildings up front. So those are the 2 schemes we have for this site. So this one, there is a little bit more difference between the 2, right? So I think once again, I want to start with the raising of hands, then we'll take your guys' input. We're already at 6:45. I think the COA one we can do kind of quickly too, so I do want to be mindful of time and not keep you guys here all night. So let's transition into the hand raising. So again, I'm going to ask you, I prefer A, I prefer B, I like both of them, I don't like either of them, okay? We'll do those as the options. So let's start with the one on the left, A. Who prefers the mixed-use village concept? Okay, I think that's probably half or maybe a little bit more than half, but close. How about option B? Preference for B. Okay, that's probably about a quarter of the room. Who likes A and B? Would be happy with either or? Fair number of votes there, great. And how about neither? Who thinks we completely missed the boat? These guys are for you guys. Yes. I'm just kidding. Yes, yeah, fair enough. So why don't we start with, I'm going to start with the negatives on these and then go to the positives, and I'm going to let you guys that all just raise your hand be the first to speak about what you're concerned about or the negatives. So where's my microphone crew? If you guys could come on up, we'll start up front.
My feeling about both these, I love the plans. They're beautifully done. They're well laid out. It's gorgeous. It's not like the Field of Dreams where if you build it, they will come. The area is kind of a dead zone anyway, this area here. So that's my feeling about this, that it's going to cost a ton of money, and you know what happens after that.
So the comment was a concern that currently it's kind of a dead zone out there, and the fear is what if we go through all of this effort and it's still that way when we come out the other end of it. So, all right, somebody else? Oh, we've got one in the back.
Hi, you speak of townhouses. What's handicapped accessible?
So, good point. A townhouse isn't necessarily handicap accessible. It can be. There are ways of doing it. And again, I think this is just meant to be a little bit illustrative. I think the way we could do the manor houses instead, like we showed on the other side, I think you'd get a similar yield. With the manor house, there's probably like a ground floor flat unit that would be handicap accessible or could be accessible, and then some units that are upstairs that you walk up to. So I think if that was something that was important to provide for this location, there are certainly ways of doing that. Even the top of shop option, it gets a little trickier because you might need an elevator or maybe a ground floor unit. But it might also be that just this site isn't necessarily the best scenario for that. Maybe tea time is where, especially where you're right next to the community center, et cetera, maybe that should be more of an issue to try to resolve for there. And here, let it be more about the density or the, yeah, yeah.
So I do like A better because I think there's more housing in A, right? It's top of shop. I'm not, personally, I see that whole area as it's a very commercial corner because of where it is. You have the Cumbies, you have all of that, the bank. I would like to see more building, less, I don't know who's going to picnic on, I wouldn't picnic on Route 6. I wouldn't want to sit there. I would add more buildings towards Route 6 so that they're visible because we want to draw people off of 6 into our commercial area. And if you want to have some seating, I would put it more interior. And I would add more buildings with more top-of-shop housing because that's one of the things we need.
And I think that's a very interesting suggestion, the idea of just sort of flipping it so that the green space is more central. I think the only challenge of that is what ends up happening is those businesses end up putting their backs to the road, so it's not a particularly interactive thing to go by. It's harder to see what's going on. And folks may be losing. I think your point is well taken. You got to find that right balance. You don't want it to feel like you're sitting on Route 6. I totally get that. So I do think it's also a matter of, even within that space, there's probably a transition from more of an edge that you don't use much, more of a central area that's sort of green and shade canopy. The real active stuff is a little bit further in. So there's nuances to this stuff that you would want to think about too. But your suggestion is a good one. It's valid. So how about over here maybe? Wherever.
Quick question. Kate Saladick, is there access to both of these from the bike trail?
So this one there's not. This community is between the bike trail, but that said, you might be able to sort of come along this edge and find your way back into it, or there might be improvements along Route 6. But yeah, unfortunately this one doesn't extend all the way back to the rail trail. So I'll do one more on the negative side, and then we'll shift to the positives.
Oh, I don't know if this is negative, but I'm not saying what I would love to see is some lovely pedestrian walkway that joins this site to tea time. And that would, to me, my mind would create more of this kind of walkable village that people talk about.
No, I think that's a great point. And that's one of the things we're hoping that as they do the Route 6 study, it would be great if along the edge of that road there's a distinct bike trail, pedestrian path separated from the traffic. But again, we're only on the sites, we're not off the sites, but I think that's a good point. So why don't we transition to comments folks have where they like what they're seeing. There's something that either in both or one scheme in particular that they're particularly fond of or appreciative of.
Jerry Magic again. Yeah, you're right. I really do like A and the density of it. And I think the green space in the front would be fine if it had a good edge. And again, I'd like to see more of this at tea time.
Anybody else? Show of hands. Got one here in the front.
My one comment about A is if you were thinking about attracting young families, if I had small children, I would not be real comfortable having them walk out of their house and be in the middle of a business. I think it would be dangerous.
Yeah, and that's a great point, and it came up the last time as well. And I think one of the things I suggested is I would think of this as less being sort of a family housing, especially if it's top of shop. That's usually more like one-bedroom apartments and things. Those are the people, if you've got a stroller, you're not going to walk up a set of stairs every day and back and forth. So I think the tea time, and I think especially the COA site that we're going to look at, lends itself a little bit more towards sort of a family housing lifestyle, whereas I think this one is probably more of a non-family kind of scenario, if you will. So how about one or two more comments on this, and then we'll keep moving?
Rich Goslin, a little bit positive, negative. I do like A better. I was only thinking, though, that you've got a delineation of the parking, and then the building, and I like the mixed use, but maybe somehow just create the whole space the way you have that front part be, maybe take that big building in the middle there, move it in the back, and then just create that whole open space on the whole site. And then you have the commercial, you have upstairs mixed use.
That's a good suggestion. So a little bit, how do you better distribute the parking so that it's not quite as concentrated like we kind of did at tea time? Yeah, it's a good suggestion. So, okay, so why don't we move on? We only have a few minutes left, although hopefully you guys are willing to go a little bit over, but let's see what we can do. Last up, Council on Aging. Tea time recommendations were, they were operating under the assumption that the COA was going to move to the tea time parcel. So housing would be the appropriate thing to do here, right? This is out in a residential community. So housing, if we're going to do something here, it should probably be housing. It would be great if we could add a public transit stop here. I did not show that in my schemes. I don't know if you can justify it with the number of units that are kind of in this zone, but I also don't know enough about how the transit operates back in that area. If there's already a bus route back there, yeah, maybe this is a good place to consider putting one. So I'm a little agnostic on that one at the moment, not to say it should be one way or the other. And just to be aware, acknowledge and honor the history of the Eastham Senior Center and those key COA supporters and leaders who helped built it. So it's been there a long time. We should be mindful of that. Whatever ends up happening, let's make sure we respect that history. Last time we showed 3 scenarios. The top left was if the COA decides to stay, they stay. Nothing really changes, right? They still have their big parking field in the back. Maybe they could expand their building a little bit. Again, one of the things they're going through is that feasibility assessment. They're going to determine whether or not they can make their current facility work better for them. So one option is that they stick around. We don't really do anything. Scenario 2, where we were trying to be a little bit creative as well. What if they move out, but maybe we keep the building, but maybe we could do something that's a little bit less intensive. Maybe it's some kind of senior services. But in the back where there's the parking lot, maybe instead we do a cottage court back there. So we do a few little cottages. You'll see what we mean by that when we get into the schemes. But we do sort of a little bit of housing and a little bit of some kind of support services. The third scheme was if the COA goes and we recognize that the building, it would cost a fortune to convert into anything else, you would probably want to just convert the whole site to residential. But how do we do that in a way that feels like it's appropriate out here? Because this is, again, this context, these are all single family homes around here, right? So we don't want to propose an apartment building here per se, but what could we do that would make sense here to take advantage of this location?
All right, in terms of survey results for the COA, so scenario 1, basically the renovate the existing building, no new housing. Very strong opinions across the board, and people who felt completely neutral. I don't know how to interpret this, people. I will say I don't. But in terms of looking at the comments from folks, there are a number of people who felt, again, strongly about housing and that there should not be a scenario where there was no housing involved. And then there are a number of people who just felt very strongly that the existing senior center and COA building should be reinvested in and stay where it is. In terms of scenario 2, this was the most popular of the 3 scenarios. Again, 10 was the most common rating, about a 7 on average, so pretty positive. A number of people were very vocally supportive of the concept of a cottage court, and particularly if the housing on this site were geared towards seniors specifically. People also liked the option of keeping some level of service in the existing building, even people who acknowledge that maybe the senior center itself moves to the tea time site or elsewhere, but like the idea of a senior living community with some support services on site. Lastly, the all residential scenario. This was by far the least preferred, but for a variety of reasons. There were the people on the one hand who just felt that this was too much residential density for the site. Other people who felt that it was not dense enough, that a single family use was inefficient and not something that they wanted the town to pursue. So again, similar negative feelings, but for very different reasons. And for a variety of practical reasons, we'll see what the team came up with.
You got one more.
I've got one more? Oh, of course I do. I'm so sorry. I think I basically went over this already. So again, many people support some kind of housing on this site, particularly if it's geared towards seniors. I mentioned the single-family efficiency. Yes, yes, I think I went over all this already. Great. I'm trying to be efficient and get you guys out of here on time. All right.
So with that super clear input, basically fives across the board again, I will say that we explored two of the scenarios. The one that we did not explore was the one in the middle, even though that was the one that got sort of the highest votes. The challenge being that we don't know if the COA left what you would repurpose it to. It's unclear. We don't know whose would be providing what services. So we kind of felt like it was sort of misleading to be like, oh, Shangri-La, you get to keep the building and we get to build these cottages, and some senior provider is going to come do something awesome here. So I think we can all visualize what that would look like if it were to proceed, because we know what the building looks like in the front, and you'll see what we mean by a cottage court in the back. So in a way, it wouldn't be hard to visualize what that scenario would be. But as we continue to talk about it afterwards, we realized that was sort of the hardest one to envision if and when that would actually come together, and it would be misleading to continue talking about that scenario. So what we have are two scenarios. The first one took me a long time to draw, so I hope you're ready for this. The COA stays in place, so nothing changes. This was great for me to just be like, all right, just gonna do that. So this is legitimately something that might happen, right? There's a chance that they might stick around, renovate the building, continue to use the building. Maybe there's some scenario where it gets used for something else. We're not sure. There's a lot of work that still needs to be done for what could happen there. So I think what was more important for us was to think about, okay, if we talk about converting it to housing, what does that look like? Because some people say, should be a little bit, should be a lot, nothing at all, the usual everywhere sort of thing. So we wanted to at least let people see what we meant by this scenario. And so this is what it could potentially look like. On the main street, we would have two buildings that would look very much like the single-family homes that you find all the way along this stretch, but with a caveat. One option could be that this one is actually a duplex. It's two small units that when combined still look like a single-family house. So suddenly we're able to provide a little more density, a unit type that we don't necessarily find. We have a lot of, average to large size single family homes, but maybe that could be a strategy for providing two units where you might expect one, doubling the density, but it's only another unit, right? Another option could be, here we drew a more conventional single family house, but said maybe there's an accessory dwelling unit above the garage. So in this case, there's a sort of more average sized unit, but then a small unit. It's another great way of getting a few more units here and there. So in effect, what we did is we said, maybe there's 4 units at the front of the site, but it looks like 2 houses. And so when I'm driving up and down Nauset, I don't even probably notice. I keep driving, right? There's just 2 more houses along the road, but we've been clever about how we've actually snuck in a few more housing options. The real sort of interesting part was then when you get back into the middle of the block, where there's the big parking lot currently, could we contemplate a cottage court? And so the idea here, I'll flip to the next one so you can get a sense of what we're talking about. Could there be a space where there's, a little shared green, there's a little shared amenity building, there's 8 little cottages back through here. I mean, those could be, 700 square feet. They don't have to be huge. There's a population that could really use housing of that nature. And again, so this, if you remember, that's our big scale of options. These were the 2 that were at the lower end of that scale, right? So a little cottage, maybe a duplex, all sort of organized around this cottage court. So if we went this route, we showed maybe there's 8 cottages, their parking's right here, because you just park and kind of walk right across the green in your front door. Another 4 here. So maybe this is like 12 units out here, right? So numerically, it sounds like crazy density. Like, wait, 12 units? But when you really look at the form of it, maybe it's reasonable. And it's worth noting, these aren't 12 3,500 square foot units, right? These are smaller units that provide options for folks that currently can't be found out on the site. And what's nice is when you combine this with what we've talked about, remember, top of shop housing at tea time. That's a very different housing type, addressing a very different type of need. The townhouses and the manor houses at tea time, that's a very different housing type with a different sort of household set of needs. So what kind of is interesting is if you conglomerate all 3 of these together, suddenly you're providing, I don't even remember, I did the math at one point, I've already forgotten it. I think we're up to like 80 units between the 3 sites, right? But no one of them is having to take all 80 units. It's trying to find the right balance of what could work where, and you get that kind of wide range of options of housing types between those 3 sites. So in any case, being long-winded here. So on this one, it's pretty straightforward. And unfortunately, the first option isn't really anybody's choice here, right? The COA needs to make a decision. They need to get through their exercise. They needed to decide what happens. So I think in this case, actually, we can still do the show of hands if we want. So let's do I love A, I love B, I love both, I hate both, real quick, all right? Show of hands for, I hope it's A. That's the only thing I'm hoping for, is that it stays put. Not a single, okay, thank you. 2 hands. How about option B? If it's got to go, let's knock it down and put some cute little thing here. Fair number of hands there, great. How about either one is fine by me? A couple folks. How about I hate both of them, you should just head out now? All right. So we are already at 7:05. I'm happy to take a few comments. We have the survey. I don't want to keep people too long. What I think, actually, let's just do I'm sure a few people have a just burning thing, especially if you live right here. I know you've got a burning thought. Burning thought, raise your hand, and we'll take those couple points. Microphone coming right here. For those of you heading out, again, we had the flyer with the website. That's going to have a link to the survey. Take the survey, tell your friends, tell your kids, get people to do it, please. So
this is more, I just want to make sure.
So folks, if you're heading out, please keep quiet so the people sticking around can still talk. Yes?
So I just wanted to make sure I understood, because I'm not sure I did. Did I hear you say, I'm not sure I fully understand why the second option that you showed earlier was completely dismissed.
Yeah.
I don't understand why, well, if the COA doesn't go in there, we can't imagine anything else that could be in there. I don't understand that. So if you could explain. And I want to make sure I understood you correctly, because I believe you said in the beginning that Scheme B is the most expensive, that this is one that is hard to imagine how much it would cost. So I just want to make sure I heard that properly.
Yep.
So if you could explain a little bit more why you couldn't imagine what would go in if COA didn't.
Right.
In that other second one.
Yeah.
And why this one, why you would offer up something that would be very, very expensive.
Right. So to clarify, absolutely. The second option, I could come up with lots of great fun things that could go into that building. It's just we're not sure if anyone is going to come and do that, right? I can say, wouldn't it be great if that was respite care? But we don't have a respite care provider that's knocking on Lauren's door. Maybe they could find one. And if I meant to say that the second option would be probably the most expensive one, because you're taking a building that was purpose-built to be a council on aging facility, and now you're trying to rethink of it as housing or respite care or some other use. The likelihood that it'd be a very expensive prospect to convert a building that wasn't really built for anything else. So if I misled, I apologize. That's part of the challenge of the middle scheme, is when we don't know what it would be. We don't know who would provide for it. I will say, though, again, if this can stay and be repurposed and only utilize the parking that's in front, then you cut this off and you paste it right there, right? And that's effectively what the second scheme was. So I was also hoping that we could sort of visualize what that scheme would be if it could go that route. Do you want to say anything more about that, Lauren? I don't know if I'm being particularly clear. I'm getting kind of tired at this point.
As we were reviewing the various options and the input from last time around, Jeremy's correct. We didn't want to be too speculative in thinking that we could both repurpose this current COA building and also put housing. And so that was why the decision was made to not present that second option, because it would be an expensive prospect to both put COA activities in a new community center and rehab or retrofit an existing building. So having both was ruled out.
So go ahead, whoever's got a mic. Yep, go ahead.
So I see there's no offsets on this from the existing properties, where all the other sites had offsets because you were concerned about the other properties. Here, you're shoving 8 units into a neighborhood. What do you think that does to the neighborhood?
So in this case, you are correct. We didn't sort of create a buffer around because...
That's a very small area. I don't think people realize how small that area is.
Yeah, I think one way of visualizing it...
The parking lot is only like 40 yards, 30 yards wide and maybe 70 yards long. And you're going to stick all that housing in the backside of that?
Yeah, so... Right, so I think one way of trying to visualize it, not that it's going to help those of you that just don't want something in there, but if you were to imagine pulling like 8 campers and parking them in that parking lot, that's effectively the effect of what that would feel like. So currently there are no buffers. The parking lot comes right up to your property line, right? So in this scheme, what we're effectively saying is tear up the parking lot, make it a green, park 8 campers on it, and let some folks move back in there. But I can appreciate, if I lived next door to this, I certainly wouldn't want it there either. But again, it's town-owned land. We've been asked to explore the options. We're looking for opportunities for housing, so this was a scheme that we.
Well, and I would add too, if your feedback is that you feel it's too many units or that there's not enough buffer, please give that feedback and we'll take it into consideration as we move forward with the process. So as Jackie said, no decisions have been made, nothing's being built. This is a conversation at this point.
Yeah. So, microphone?
Hi, should the COA decide that they'd like to move to this proposed community center, what about the town giving the property to Habitat for development of affordable home ownership in the town? Cluster housing.
No, I think that's a great version of this, is that these are Habitat homes. Maybe not exactly this layout, maybe it's 8 homes instead of 12, but I do think that's an interesting, it's a scale of project that Habitat can do too. They're happy in that 8 to 10 kind of unit range. That's a good scenario as well. Yeah. Yes.
Hi, I'm Joan Lockhart, and I actually chair the COA Town Committee. There is a tremendous need in town with a growing senior population for a daycare respite center for people just to drop off an adult so that a caregiver gets a break. And that may not be a huge reconfiguration of the property. So I think it's unfair not to look at that option.
Okay.
Yes, I'm one of the people that live around the perimeter of this proposed possible redevelopment. And, I think that if housing is a need, and it certainly is, affordable housing, your sites emphasize the fact that, your websites, in talking about these proposals, that it makes more sense to put the housing on a site like the Tea Time rather than a quiet residential neighborhood. What we have is a quiet residential neighborhood on Dexter and on Chatham Street. There are 5 single-family homes on each of those, plus another set of single-family homes on Nauset Road and up on Schoolhouse. This will radically change, with the density that you're proposing, radically change, this quiet residential neighborhood. And, if the acreage here is very small compared to the acreage you have available at the other 2 sites.
Okay, thank you.
I just would like to counter his comment. It's proposed to be senior housing, correct?
That could be an option.
Yeah, so it's not, I thought it was senior housing. Okay, I mean, if it is.
I'm sorry, just to answer your question, in developing the concepts, it was, in mind, we had trying to honor that the current use of this property is dedicated towards seniors, so that would be an option that we would definitely be looking at seriously for the housing focus.
Okay, well, my comment is senior housing would be quiet. I think quiet neighborhoods, yeah, it's not going to add
I would just say, especially if it's senior housing, which I think is appropriate, but now you're talking about maybe 10 or 12 seniors as opposed to the, 50 or, I mean, some days that lot is full. There are so many people coming and going, and there's outdoor activities there. So it's actually, to me, a lesser density of that area.
Mm-hmm.
However, I think if it is senior housing, having parking not being at the houses is a problem.
Yeah, no, thank you. I will suggest that the intention there is, that's 50 feet. So it's like walking through your front yard. When we talk about this, sometimes we point out, the seniors go to the store, right? It's not like they always park in the first aisle of the grocery store. They still park 40, 50 feet away. It's a good point. I'm not going to try to totally defend the difference there. We often find that the trade-off of that shared green is sort of so wonderful that people are willing to make that trade-off. But if you're talking specifically about seniors, it depends on the seniors too, right? This probably suggests a fair level of independence that you're able to live in this. Are you signing up? You're buying our first one? All right. You'll walk, you'll do it. There you go. There's your answer. Yes, sir.
I apologize if this comes off in a little bit of a harsh tone, but I'm in a butter to the Tea Time property. I'll put that out there. Does the town have any timeframes on any of these three proposals? I'm just looking to see, I mean, God willing, I may have 45 years left at this property, but members of my family may not. And I don't mean that in a harsh way, but I'm just saying, in anticipation of these projects moving forward, which is all well and good, and I'm supportive of the projects, I'm just trying to find out is it 10 years, 15 years, 20 years? Does the town have a rough expectation about when each of these projects may move forward with waste, other things to be considered?
So this process, we're dedicating a year to. And then we'd love to have some things that we could send out to developers next year. Wastewater, we should be ready to present to you guys in fiscal year '24, so 2 years from now. So we're looking at trying to get some of this stuff done in 5 years or so. However, it also depends on who's paying for what and what developers we can attract to any element of this. It was never our intention for the town, you taxpayers, us, to pay for all of it. We're looking for partners, so that's why I think, what Joan said is totally legitimate, but we would be looking for a commercial partner who would want to come in and run a day center. The town is not going to do that. So we need to, if that's part of the thing, we would look for that. So we've always talked about doing it in phases. My guess would be tea time would be in the first, or Town Center Plaza, and then tea time would be in that order. This one would be the last developed.
This is a question about timeframe. I mean, we expecting something in 5 years.
I say 5 years. My assistant, who's my finance director, says, Jackie, it'll be 10. But
Well, and the other thing is that this process, the master plan, will result in recommendations for phasing and how that can happen and what this team believes is feasible. So we'll have some more of those answers as the year proceeds.
And to reinforce something that Jackie said, there are going to be partners to do this, right? So even the things I'm drawing are just ideas to get you guys a sense of scale, but I don't think the town's going to say, here it is, build this. It's just going to help the town get a sense of, we're comfortable with 8 to 10 units, 30 to 40 units. We want it to be a village character. This is kind of what we were thinking about. These are the schemes we came up with. The development community is going to have a slightly different take on some of those things depending on who the partner is. Especially if we're talking 5 to 10 years from now, it's going to be a different economic scenario, likely, hopefully. Right, so there's a lot of things that will morph a little bit too, but this is a very useful process for laying out a vision and having you guys get on board with the kinds of numerical things that you'll be talking about with the development community. So I also want to make that clear, like don't panic that whatever we draw as the sort of final thing in the fall is the scheme. It is just a great visual to help guide conversations with potential partners around how it might go. I don't know if that helps or not, but.
And this is intended to be your vision as the community that we then would present to potential partners and developers to explain to them that this is what our community wants, which we're really kind of taking on that phase, taking it on ourselves to do that part, which typically is outsourced to a developer or a construction team to do that part of it. So we're taking that on as a community so that we get a project and projects that work for us. And that's why this process is so important.
So given the time.
Thank you. Yeah, let's wrap up and talk about what's next.
Finish up, but I'm certainly happy to stick around and keep talking to folks if they'd like. So this is really it. Next steps. We are wrapping up the second presentation. We still have another presentation coming this fall, as we mentioned. Lauren's been working on an event at Tea Time for June 25th. Keep an eye out for that. Actually, like family fun activities, things. You want to talk about it?
I can talk about that briefly. So we are hosting a summer kickoff and ice cream social event with our rec department on the Tea Time property, June 25th from 12 to 3 p.m. The Ice Cream Cafe out of Orleans is going to be providing ice cream. The town's buying. So while supplies last, come out and get your ice cream. You got to get there early. We're going to have old-fashioned field day style games. So think like sack races, tug of war, music, face painting. So come out, bring your families, enjoy the site, and we'll have some sort of interactive activity related to this process to start to get people thinking about how that property could look and be used. So it will continue what we've been working on this evening.
And then there'll also be an event, we're being mindful of the fact that the Eastham community does include some folks that are here on a part-time basis. They're only around probably in the summer, so the thought is to do an event in July where the folks that aren't here year-round, remember one of our initial guiding principles was develop something here that's useful for all Eastham residents, right? So we want to make sure we're capturing as many of those thoughts and opinions as we can. So there'll be an event then, and we're still kicking around the idea of potentially a few other additional events or meetings between now and then. But again, you guys largely get the summer off, and we'll see you guys in the fall. So keep looking at the website. Again, please, anyone you know that wasn't here tonight that you think would be interested, please drive them to the site, have them do the survey.
And really quickly, just before everybody dashes out, if you have additional ideas of how we can improve outreach, please reach out to me. We want to make sure that we're including as many perspectives and voices in this process as possible. We don't want anyone to think that we're not intentionally including them, so please let us know if there's something we can do differently, or if you have ideas for additional events we can host. We're all ears to that, and my contact information is on the town website, or you can come grab me after the event. So thank you to Jeremy and Jeff. Thank you to the library for hosting us. We appreciate as well our video services team staying late to record. Thank you all for coming.